what Putin is fundamentally interested in is territory. He holds a significant chunk of Ukrainian territory. He would certainly like to hold more, but he's not in a position to push that line. I think that what he does want is fundamentally control over escalation. He wants to be able to breach whatever ceasefire emerges, whether that's by moving troops to the west or whether that's by sending missiles across the line and drones across the line, as we've seen just again in the last 24 hours with the attack on Chernobyl, to be able to do so without consequence, without real deterrence from the Western side. That leaves him in control of the situation and allows him to make the decisions about how and when this war continues. And so anything that would make that impossible, I think, is something that he would resist, quite vociferously. Whether, in fact, he'll have the leverage to resist that if the Ukrainians and the Europeans insist on it is a different question.
Let's begin with our top story. President Zelensky will be addressing the Munich Security Conference today to make his case for continued support for Ukraine after the all-out, full-scale Russian invasion nearly 3 years ago. The Ukrainian leader's having to perform a difficult balancing act after President Trump said he's starting peace talks with Vladimir Putin. He's to try to keep the Americans on side while also sticking to his own red lines when it comes to any concessions to Russia. Sam Greene joins us this morning, director of the Russia Institute at King's College London and author of Putin versus the People. Sam, good morning.
Good morning.
I've been thoroughly enjoying your analysis on X on this, and that's what I want to try and get into a bit with you this morning, if I may. So I suppose we start with where we were a few days ago, before this security conference, where the Trump administration suddenly announced that peace talks were going to happen after this 90-minute phone call with Vladimir Putin. When we consider that from a couple of days ago and where we're at now on Saturday morning, are we in a different place?
Oh, well, it's very hard to know where we are with President Trump, if we're perfectly honest. I think that Trump is clearly eager to move quickly. I think to a certain extent, even Putin is eager to move quickly, at least in the process with Trump. I'm not convinced that he's interested in a quick resolution to this war. In fact, I'm rather convinced that he's not. I think that they both realize that if they want to be able to do a deal that suits them better than suits anybody else, they need to do it before the Ukrainians and the Europeans have a chance to react. And I think on that level, things have shifted a bit. So this all started also with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth saying that there would be no route to NATO for Ukraine. So he took that immediately off the table and handed that to the Russians. We also saw some rhetoric around the idea that the U.S. would not backstop any European intervention to serve as essentially a peacekeeping force. And we've seen them row back on that as well, putting some of this leverage back on the table. But what that has done is to signal both that there is room here for Europe to act, and that at the end of the day, the Trump administration can't be entirely oblivious to the public reaction and the European reaction and the Ukrainian reaction to what he and his administration are saying.
It's interesting to consider, I suppose, whether, as you've outlined, whether there is a kind of Washington and Moscow on one side and a Ukraine and the rest of Europe on the other. And that seems like an odd battle, if you like. Those seem like odd teams to be considering in this.
Well, it's certainly, I think, what Mr. Putin sees as his potential, sort of best case scenario. I'm not entirely convinced, again, that that's the way it will play out, or that it's the way that the Trump administration wants to see it play out. I think the Trump administration, frankly, simply wants to get some kind of a resolution out of this and is slightly less concerned than the Europeans, and certainly much less concerned than the Ukrainians are about the exact contours of this deal. They figure that Ukrainian and European security are down to the Ukrainians and the Europeans to sort out. And so if the Europeans are content to abandon the field to the United States, then they will essentially have to take whatever it is that Trump and Putin agree to. But I think what we've seen again in the vibes coming out of Munich just in the past 24 hours is that Europeans likely are not content, and I would include the UK in that, to simply allow a deal to be done. No deal is going to stick. No deal is going to create durable security, first of all, without Ukrainian buy-in. It's their lives and their security at the end of the day, but also without European support. And so there is a lot of agency here.
Yeah. Can I ask what you make of Sir Keir Starmer's comments after his phone call with President Zelensky, that he was really quite insistent, reiterating Britain's support for Ukraine's admission to NATO, which directly contrasts with Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth's take on this, which is that this was not going to happen. So the Defence Secretary and the President both saying that NATO was not going to allow Ukraine to join. Has Sir Keir Starmer been bold on that to contradict what was coming from the US administration?
Well, he has been very straightforward, and I think the Ukrainians will certainly appreciate that. I think that the fact is he's navigating two competing realities. One reality is exactly as you've said, that the Trump administration has been, to put it mildly, very cold on the idea of Ukrainian accession to NATO. It's one of the things also that Russia has set up as a red line for their position. But the reality is also, if Europe is committed to providing durable and really ironclad security for Ukraine, there isn't really a substitute for NATO. Any other route to security for Ukraine would be less certain, would be less secure, and would likely be considerably more expensive. And so, most of the security thinkers, including in Washington, frankly, who've been looking at this, have come to the conclusion that eventually NATO is going to be the place where Ukraine is going to need to land if it doesn't indeed want to seek that level of security. But the other thing that I think Mr. Starmer is doing is he's making a choice. He is signaling that, if pushed and pulled between Washington and Europe, that the UK is going to align itself in terms of security of the European continent with its European partners.
Yeah. What about Putin? In your analysis, Sam, what would be an acceptable deal for him?
Well, I don't think, for the moment at least, that what Putin is fundamentally interested in is territory. He holds a significant chunk of Ukrainian territory. He would certainly like to hold more, but he's not in a position to push that line. I think that what he does want is fundamentally control over escalation. He wants to be able to breach whatever ceasefire emerges, whether that's by moving troops to the west or whether that's by sending missiles across the line and drones across the line, as we've seen just again in the last 24 hours with the attack on Chernobyl, to be able to do so without consequence, without real deterrence from the Western side. That leaves him in control of the situation and allows him to make the decisions about how and when this war continues. And so anything that would make that impossible, I think, is something that he would resist, quite vociferously. Whether, in fact, he'll have the leverage to resist that if the Ukrainians and the Europeans insist on it is a different question.
And so, I suppose, if we try to unpick the strategies all around here, your suggestion earlier was that this will take quite some time. Trump's assertion that he would end this war in 24 hours after inauguration has obviously come and gone. Here we are a few weeks in, but actually these things will still take weeks, months, whatever, to actually arrange and get over the finish line. Does that advantage Putin, the fact that there is perhaps a veneer of talks happening? What happens militarily in that context? Would he still be fighting?
Well, I do think that it advantages Putin if we allow it to, right? So Putin's calculation is that he's interested in winning the war. The West, certainly in the Trump administration, is interested in ending the war. And those are slightly different things, right? So once he locks the West into a negotiating process, he knows that he can push the line while Western politicians and Western societies will remain committed to something akin to a peace process, which means they will be reluctant to retaliate. They will be reluctant to respond to escalation with escalation, and they will try to, hold Kiev's hands behind its back to a certain extent, as Kiev itself responds to whatever Russia does. Again, as we've seen, Russia has escalated in the midst of these conversations with the Trump administration, so it doesn't feel bound to limit its own action. It assumes that we will feel bound to limit ours. That, of course, is a question that Western governments will have to resolve for themselves.
Sam, really good to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us. Sam Greene, there, director of the Russia Institute at King's College London and author of Putin versus the People.